The wind was coming down off the high pasture, the way wind always came down in that valley, dry and patient and tasting of cutty, when Hannah May Whitlock set the last staple into the cedar post and stood up straight in the dust. Her hands were bleeding in two places she hadn't noticed yet. Her dress, the navy one she'd worn to her husband's funeral and then to every job interview that had laughed her out of every office in 3 counties, was torn at the hem where the barbed wire had caught it that morning. There was a smear of grease on her cheek, and her hair had come loose from its pins an hour ago, and she was, by every measure the world used to measure women like her, exactly what they'd called her at the feed store the day before. Too big, too old, too soft, too late. And yet she was the one holding the wire stretchers. She was the one who had walked the broken line of the south fence at sunrise and counted in her quiet head the 17 places it had been cut clean rather than worn through. She was the one, fat fingers and torn dress and all, who had looked at Silas Brennan's drowning ranch and seen, underneath the rot, the bones of something that could still be saved. He had only hired her to mend his fence. He had said it that way, plain, the way he said everything, standing on his porch with his hat in his hand, and grief still pooled under his eyes like rainwater that hadn't drained. "Just the fence, Mom. 3 days' work if you can do it. I'll pay fair." She had nodded once, because nodding was cheaper than speaking, and because she had $4.62 in her dead husband's tobacco tin, and no other offer in the world. Neither of them knew, standing there in the late August light, with the cottonwoods turning their leaves silver in the breeze, that the fence was the smallest thing she was going to fix. If something in this has already caught at you somewhere under the ribs, stay with me to the end of this one and subscribe, so the next story finds you, and do me the kindness of telling me in the comments what town or city you're listening from tonight, because I like to know how far a story like Hannah's can travel before the sun comes up. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning is always earlier than people think. Hannah May had been born Hannah May Coffey in a sod and plank house on the wrong side of the Cimarron, the 7th child of a woman who counted her babies the way other women counted chickens, and a father who counted nothing at all. She had been a big child, and then a big girl, and then a big woman, and the word big had been said to her, at her, about her, in every register a human voice could produce, since before she had teeth enough to bite back. She had learned early that the world had a number it wanted to attach to her, and the number was always the wrong one, and arguing with it only made the number louder. So she had stopped arguing. She had learned instead to work. She had learned to set a snare and skin a rabbit by the time she was 9, to drive a team by the time she was 12, to shoe a horse, patch a roof, deliver a calf, and read a sky for weather by the time she was 15. She had married Tom Whitlock at 18 because he was the only boy in 3 counties who had looked at her without first measuring her, and she had buried him at 29 because a horse he had no business breaking had broken him instead. They had been married 11 years, and they had loved each other in the slow, undemonstrative way of people who had nothing to prove between them. And when he died, she had stood at the grave dry-eyed, not because she didn't grieve, but because the kind of grief she carried did not know how to come out of her face. It came out of her hands instead. For a year after Tom went into the ground, she had run the little place they'd built together, 40 acres and a milk cow and a garden she could feed half the road off of. And she had run it well, and the bank had still taken it. The bank had taken it the way banks took things, politely, with paper, while the manager looked at her ruined dress and her ruined hands, and said he was sure a woman of her particular situation would find the adjustment for the best. A woman of her particular situation. He had meant fat. He had meant widowed. He had meant alone. He had meant 100 small cruelties dressed up in a banker's collar, and she had stood in front of his desk and said nothing, because saying something would have cost her the last of her dignity, and dignity, she had long since decided, was the only currency the world could not actually confiscate. She had walked out of that bank with a carpet bag and her husband's tobacco tin and the navy dress on her back, and she had walked, literally walked, the 11 miles into the town of Ash Hollow, because she had sold the wagon to pay the last of the funeral. That had been 3 weeks before the morning she put the last staple into Silas Brennan's south fence. 3 weeks of sleeping in the loft above Mrs. Pell's laundry in exchange for hauling water. 3 weeks of being turned away from every honest position in town because the positions for women were clerk and seamstress and schoolmarm, and the clerks wanted pretty, and the seamstress wanted thin enough to model her work, and the schoolmarm wanted respectable, and Hannah May, in their estimation, was none of these things. She was, in their estimation, a problem the town would prefer to solve by having her leave. She had heard the word heifer said behind her in the feed store the morning before Silas Brennan rode in. She had heard it, and she had not turned her head. She had just kept counting the nails into the paper sack the storekeeper was filling for someone else's order, because turning her head would have given the word a target, and she had learned, long ago, never to be a target on purpose. Silas Brennan had walked in 2 minutes later. He was a tall man, lean the way men get lean from work and not from vanity, with a face the sun had been at for 40 years and eyes the color of a creek bottom in shadow. He wore a black band on his sleeve, and he had not shaved in some days. And there was about him the particular stillness of a man who has recently lost something he did not know how to live without. He had asked the storekeeper, in a voice pitched low, whether anybody in town knew fence work and would take day wages, and the storekeeper had laughed, not unkindly, but not kindly either, and said every able-bodied man in the county was up at the Halloran roundup and wouldn't be back for 10 days. And Silas had nodded once and turned to go. And Hannah May, who had been counting nails she was not buying for a sack she was not carrying, had said, without lifting her eyes, "I can mend fence." The store had gone the particular kind of quiet that towns go when they are deciding whether to be cruel out loud. The storekeeper had snorted. Silas had stopped at the door. He had turned, slow, and he had looked at her, and she had felt the look the way she felt all looks, braced. But the look had not been what she expected. He had not looked at her body. He had looked at her hands. Her hands were resting on the counter, and they were what they were, broad and scarred and strong, with a white seam across the back of the left one from a barbed wire that had caught her at 16, and a permanent thickening at the base of the right thumb from 20 years of pliers. He had looked at her hands for about 3 seconds, and then he had looked at her face, and he had said, "You done it before." It had not been a question. She had said, "All my life." He had nodded once, the way she had nodded on the porch later, and he had said, "I got 17 breaks in 3 miles of South Line. I can pay $1 a day and board, 3 days' work. If you can be ready at sunup, I'll come for you." The storekeeper had opened his mouth to say something, and Silas had not even turned his head, had only said, "Quiet, Earl." And Earl had been quiet, because something in the way Silas Brennan said, "Quiet," did not invite a second opinion. Hannah May had said, "I'll be ready," and Silas had touched the brim of his hat once and walked out, and the bell over the door had rung after him like a small, clean punctuation mark on the end of a sentence she had not expected to be in. She had walked back to Mrs. Bell's loft in the late heat, and she had sat on the straw tick, and she had taken out the tobacco tin and counted the $4.62 again, because counting it was a habit now. And she had thought, $3. $3 and board, 3 days. And she had not let herself think any further than that, because thinking further than 3 days was a luxury she had not been able to afford in a long time. Silas Brennan had come for her in a buckboard at first light. He had not spoken on the ride out, except to say good morning and to point, once, at a hawk lifting off a fence post with something small and limp in its talons, as if the hawk were a thing they were both witnessing together and worth acknowledging. The ranch lay 7 miles west of town in a long shallow bowl the locals called Brennan's Draw, after his father, who had broken the first sod there in 1871. It was good country, or it had been. She could see, as the buckboard topped the rise, that it had been beautiful once and was beautiful still in the bones. But the bones were showing. The barn roof was sway-backed on the east side. The hay meadow had not been cut in time and was going to seed. There were 2 horses in the near pasture, and one of them was favoring a foreleg in a way nobody had bothered to wrap. The house was a low whitewashed thing with a deep porch and a stone chimney, and there were curtains in the windows that had been white once and were grey now, not from dirt, but from no one having taken them down to wash. A woman had lived here, Hannah May understood without being told, and the woman did not live here any more. He had pulled up at the porch and helped her down, which surprised her, because most men did not bother with that courtesy for a woman of her size, having decided in advance that she did not need it or would not want it or would break their hand. He had helped her down without comment, and he had said, "I'll show you the line," and they had walked it together in the cool early light, and she had counted in her head the 17 breaks he had named, and she had counted also the 4 he had not. Because 4 of the breaks were not breaks. They were cuts, clean, deliberate, made with a good pair of nippers, and made recently within the week, because the cut ends had not yet weathered. She did not say anything about the cuts on that first walk. She filed it away the way she filed everything she was not ready to look at yet. She said only, "I can have the 17 mended by Friday sundown if the weather holds." And he said, "Good," and that was the extent of their conversation until noon. At noon, he brought her a tin plate of cold biscuit and bacon and a jar of buttermilk, and he set them on a flat rock near where she was working, and he said, "You eat," and she said, "Thank you." And he stood for a moment as if he wanted to say something else, and then did not, and walked back toward the barn. She ate, sitting on the rock, with the wind in the grass, and the sky going that particular hard blue it goes in late August, when the summer is starting to remember it is mortal. And she thought, 4 cuts. And she thought, he doesn't know. And she thought, I'm not here to tell him. I'm here to mend his fence. And then she thought, but somebody is cutting his fence. And then she did not let herself think any further than that. She finished at sundown on Friday, as she had said she would, and she walked the line one more time in the gold light to check her work. And when she came up to the barn, Silas was standing in the door of it with a coil of rope over his shoulder, watching her come. He paid her the $3 in coin out of a leather purse, and he counted them into her palm one at a time, which she appreciated without being able to say why. And he said, "Stay for supper before I take you back." She said, "You don't have to." He said, "I know." She stayed for supper. He cooked it himself, which she also did not comment on, beans and cornbread and a piece of ham. And they ate at the kitchen table with a single lamp between them and the house ticking and settling around them the way old houses do when the day's heat goes out of the boards. He did not ask her anything personal. She did not offer anything personal. They ate in a silence that was not awkward, only careful, the silence of two people who have each been hollowed out by something and are not in the mood to compare wounds. When they were nearly done, he set down his fork and he said, "You found the cuts." She set down her own fork. She said, "4 of them." He said, "I wondered if you would." She said, "I wasn't sure you wanted to know I knew." He said, "I want to know what you know." Always. So she told him. She told him about the cut ends and the angle of the bite and the fact that whoever had done it had used a good tool and had done it on foot, not from horseback, because the cuts were at a height a man would make squatting and not standing in a stirrup. She told him she did not know who. She told him she suspected he did. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There's a man named Cyrus Latimer, owns the spread north of mine. He has wanted my water for 9 years. He has offered to buy me out 4 times since my wife took sick and twice since she passed. The last offer was a week before you came. I told him no. The cuts started after. He said it the way he said everything, without ornament, and she heard in it the weight of a man who had been carrying something alone and had just, without quite meaning to, set one corner of it down. She said, "I can stay. I can keep mending what he cuts. I can keep walking the line." He looked at her across the lamp. He said, $1 a day and board." She said, $1 a day and board." He said, "There's a room off the kitchen was my mother's. It's clean. You can have it." She said, "All right." He said, "Hannah May." It was the first time he had used her name. She said, "Yes." He said, "I am grateful." She did not know what to do with that. She had not been told she was a thing to be grateful for in a long time, perhaps ever. And she felt the words land somewhere in her chest, in a place that had been numb so long. She had forgotten it could feel anything. She did not let it show on her face. She said, "I learn it." He said, "You already have." She moved her carpet bag and the tobacco tin into the room off the kitchen the next morning. The room was small and whitewashed and had a narrow bed with a quilt on it that someone had pieced by hand a long time ago, and a washstand with a chipped pitcher, and a single window that looked east toward the cottonwoods along the creek. She set the tobacco tin on the windowsill where the morning light would touch it, and she stood for a moment looking at it, and she thought, 3 days has become a week. She did not let herself think any further than the week. She walked the line every morning at sunrise. She mended what needed mending, and she noted what was new. By the end of the 2nd week, there had been 3 more cuts, all on the south line, all within sight of the Latimer fence corner. She mended them all. She did not tell Silas every time. She told him on Sundays when they sat on the porch in the evening with coffee, and she would name the places and the days, and he would listen without interrupting. And at the end he would say, "Thank you." and they would sit a while longer in the dark with the coffee going cold in their cups. There was an old man who lived in a small cabin behind the barn, whose name was Obadiah Pike, and who had worked for Silas's father before Silas was born. He was past 70 and bent at the shoulders, and had a beard the color of old snow and a tongue that had not been trained to politeness in any decade of his life. He had watched Hannah May arrive with an expression of frank skepticism, and on her third day he had walked up to her at the fence and said, "You ain't gonna last, missus. The sun out here eats women like you." She had set the staple she was holding into the post and driven it home with 2 clean strokes of the hammer, and she had said, without turning, "Son's been eating me 41 years, hasn't finished yet." He had made a noise that might have been a laugh and might have been a cough, and he had walked away. And the next morning, when she came out before light, there had been a tin cup of coffee sitting on the porch rail with a saucer over it to keep the dust out. She had drunk it without comment. The cup had been there every morning since. By the end of the 3rd week, she had repaired the barn roof on the east side because she had climbed up to check a flashing and found 3 rafters cracked, and she had not asked permission. She had simply done it, working in the cool of the early mornings with lumber she found in the loft. Silas had come out one morning and stood in the yard watching her bring a board up the ladder on her shoulder, and he had not said anything, and she had not said anything, and when she came down for water at mid-morning, he had simply said, "The west side needs it too, when you've a mind," and she had said, "I'll have a mind tomorrow." And that was the way the work got divided between them from then on. She did the things she saw needed doing. He let her. She wrapped the foreleg of the horse that had been favoring it, a sorrel mare named Pepper, and the swelling went down in 4 days. She cut the hay meadow with the old mower out of the shed, which she had to rebuild a gear on first, and she and Obadiah stacked it in the loft, and Obadiah, halfway through the 3rd afternoon, sweating and swearing, looked at her over a forkful of Timothy and said, "You stack like a man." She said, "I stack like a woman who's been stacking since she was 10. He said, "Same thing," she said, "not even close." He grinned for the first time since she'd met him, a yellow, ruined grin that transformed his face entirely. And he said, "All right, missus, all right." She washed the curtains. She did that on a Tuesday afternoon when the wind had laid and the air was full of the small green smell of the cottonwoods. And she took them down 1 room at a time and washed them in the big copper boiler out behind the kitchen and hung them on the line. And when Silas came in at dusk and walked through the house, he stopped in the front parlor and stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the white curtains lifting in the open window. And she heard him, from where she was at the stove, make a small sound that was not a word and not a sob and not a sigh, but had something of all 3 in it. She did not turn around. She did not say anything. She gave him that moment alone with whatever it was, and she stirred the beans. And after a while, he came into the kitchen and washed his hands at the basin and said, "Smells good," and she said, "Almost ready," and they ate. He did not mention the curtains. He did not need to. Cyrus Latimer came to call on a Thursday in the 2nd week of September. She heard the horse first, a good horse, expensive, the rhythm of its trot too clean for a working animal, and she stepped out onto the porch, drying her hands on her apron. And she watched him come up the long drive, with the kind of attention she usually saved for weather. He was a man perhaps 50, well-fed without being soft, dressed in a town coat that had been cut by somebody who knew what he was doing, with a hat that had never been rained on, and boots that had never broken a horse. He rode the way a man rides who has never had to walk home, and when he came up to the porch, he tipped his hat to her with a smile that was all teeth and no eyes. Mrs. Whitlock, he said, before she had told him her name, and she filed that away too. He had asked about her. He had asked about her in town. He had ridden out here knowing exactly who would be on the porch. Mr. Latimer, she said, because she could play that game as well as he could. The smile thinned a degree and recovered. He swung down without being invited and looped his reins over the rail and came up the steps as if he had been coming up them all his life. "Is Silas to home?" he said. "He is not," she said, which was true. Silas had ridden out at first light to look at a stretch of the North Line and would not be back until supper. "A shame," Latimer said. "I'd hoped to catch him. Perhaps you'd be good enough to take a message." "I would," she said, and did not move from where she stood, and did not invite him to sit, and did not offer him water, because hospitality, she had learned, was a knife that cut both ways, and she was not in the mood to be cut. He stood on her porch, because that was how she was thinking of it now, her porch, and he looked out across the yard with the proprietary slow gaze of a man pricing a thing he intended to own, and he said, "Tell him my offer stands. Tell him it stands until the 1st of October. Tell him after that the price comes down, because by then half this place will be in receivership, and we both know it," she said. "I'll tell him you said so." He looked at her then properly, the way the banker had looked at her, the way the storekeeper had looked at her, the long, flat assessing look of a man tallying her and finding her wanting. And he said with that same smile, "You're a sensible woman, Mrs. Whitlock. Sensible women understand when a thing is finished. Talk to him. He listens to women. His Mary always could turn him. Perhaps you can too." She did not flinch. She did not, by any movement of her face, give him the satisfaction of seeing that he had used a dead woman as a lever against a living man in front of her on her own front porch. She only said, "I'm not his Mary, Mr. Latimer, and I don't turn men. I mend fences. Some I mend with wire. Some I mend with silence. You'll get one or the other from me. Choose." The smile went out of his face like a lamp going out all at once, and for a half a second she saw what was under it, and what was under it was the same thing she had seen under every man like him she had ever met, which was a small, frightened, greedy boy who had learned to wear an expensive coat. Then the smile came back. He tipped his hat again. He said, "A pleasure, ma'am." He went down the steps and mounted up and rode out, and she stood on the porch until the dust of him was gone, and then she sat down on the top step because her knees had decided, without asking her, that they would prefer to be lower to the ground for a little while. Obadiah came around the corner of the barn with a hoe over his shoulder. He had been, she understood without being told, within earshot of the entire conversation, because Obadiah Pike had not lasted 70 years on this place by being where he was not useful. He came up to the bottom of the steps, and he leaned on the hoe, and he looked up at her, and he said, "Mrs." She said, "Obadiah." He said, "You just made an enemy." She said, "I made him an enemy the day I rode in here. I only just now let him know I knew it." He chewed on that a moment. He said, "Silas ought to hear about this before sundown." She said, "He will." He said, "You want me to ride out and fetch him?" She said, "No. Let him finish his day's work. A few hours won't change what Latimer means to do." He nodded slowly. He said, "You handle yourself, Mrs." She said, "I've had practice." He grinned the yellow grin again and went back around the barn. And she sat on the step a while longer and watched the cottonwoods turn their leaves in a wind she could not yet feel on the porch. And she thought about the way Latimer had said Mary. And she thought about a man riding the North Line, not knowing that his dead wife had just been used as a coin in a transaction on his own front steps. And something in her, some small hard gold thing she had not known was there, set itself like a staple driven home. She told Silas at supper. She told him plain, the way he liked things, without dressing it up and without leaving anything out, including the part about Mary, because leaving that part out would have been a kind of lying. And she had decided early that whatever she was going to be in this house, she was not going to be a liar in it. He listened without moving. He held his fork in his hand, and he did not eat, and he did not look at her, and he did not look away. When she was done, he set the fork down very carefully, as if it was something that might break, and he said her name. She said, he said her name. He said, to you. She said, to me. He said, on my porch. She said, on your porch. He was quiet a long time. The lamp between them made a small, steady sound. Outside, a coyote called once on the ridge, and another answered it farther off, and then the night held its breath the way it does. He said finally, "Hannah May." She said, "Yes." He said, "You did right." She said, "I know." He said, "He won't stop." She said, "I know that too." He said, "It's going to get worse before it gets better." She said, "Most things do." He almost smiled then. It did not quite reach his mouth, but it moved through his eyes the way light moves underwater, and she saw it and filed it away with the rest of what she was keeping. He said, "I want you to know something." She said, "All right." He said, "If you want to go, now is the time. After tonight, it won't be safe to be on this place in the way it was safe yesterday. You came here to mend a fence. You have mended more than the fence. You have earned the $3, and you have earned the room, and you have earned the right to walk out that door tomorrow morning with my thanks and a letter of character to any place in the territory. And no man, including me, will think less of you for it." She looked at him across the lamp. She looked at his weathered face and his grieving eyes, and his big careful hands resting on either side of his plate. And she thought about the bank manager and the storekeeper, and the 11 miles she had walked into Ash Hollow with her carpet bag and her tobacco tin. And she thought about the white curtains lifting in the open window. And she thought about the cup of coffee on the porch rail every morning under its saucer. And she thought about a man who had looked at her hands before he looked at her face. She said, "Mr. Brennan," he said. "Silas," she said, "Silas. I have been walked off of places my whole life. Some I walked off of because I was told to, and some I walked off of because I thought I'd save somebody the trouble of telling me. I'm not going to walk off of this one. Not for Cyrus Latimer. Not for anybody. You hired me to mend your fence. The fence is not mended yet. I will tell you when it is." He looked at her a long moment. Then he said 2 words, the way he said everything, without ornament. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Eat your supper. It's getting cold." He ate his supper. She ate hers. They did not speak again that night about Latimer, or about Mary, or about what was coming. They spoke instead, in small, quiet sentences across the lamp, about the hay in the loft, and the mare's foreleg, and whether the weather would hold through the weekend. And when the dishes were done, she went to the room off the kitchen, and she closed the door, and she sat down on the edge of the narrow bed, and she put her face in her hands, not crying, only sitting that way. because some kinds of feeling do not have anywhere else to go and have to be held for a while in the palms before they can be put down. The first thing burned 3 nights later. It was the small hay shed at the bottom of the south pasture, the one she had not yet gotten to, the one with the loose shingles and the bad door. She woke to the smell before she woke to the light. That particular sweet wrong smell of cured hay going up. And she was out of the bed and into her boots and dress before her mind had caught up to her body. And she was through the kitchen and out the back door, with the bucket from the washstand still in her hand because she had grabbed it without thinking. Silas was already in the yard. He was barefoot and shirtless, with his trousers pulled on over his union suit and a rifle in his hand. And his face in the red light from the south pasture was a face she had not seen on him before. And she understood, looking at it, that she was seeing the face Silas Brennan wore when he was deciding whether to kill a man. The shed was gone. There was no saving the shed. By the time they got down to it with buckets, the roof had fallen in and the walls were going, and all they could do was wet the grass around it and beat out the sparks that flew toward the dry pasture. And they did that, the 3 of them, Silas and Hannah May, and Obadiah, for 2 hours in the dark, with the smoke in their teeth and the heat on their faces. And when the grey light finally came up over the eastern ridge, there was nothing left of the shed but a black square in the grass, and a smell that would be in their clothes for a week. Silas walked the perimeter as the light came up. He found what she had known he would find: boot prints in the soft ground by the creek crossing, a horse tied at the cottonwoods and gone now, a scrap of oiled cloth caught on the lower wire of the fence where someone had crawled through fast, the kind of cloth a man wraps around a bottle of kerosene to keep it from sloshing. He brought the scrap of cloth back to her in his palm. He held it out. She looked at it. She said he didn't come himself. He sent somebody. He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Latimer's boots are size 12. I saw them on my porch. These prints are 9s. He hires it done." She had not known she had noted the size of Cyrus Latimer's boots, but she had, the way she noted everything, because that was the kind of woman the world had made her, the kind that noted, because noting was the only weapon she had been allowed to carry. Silas looked at her a long moment in the grey light, with the smoke still rising behind her, and he said, "You see everything, don't you?" She said, "I see what I have to." He said, "Hannah May." She said, "Don't." He said, "Don't what?" She said, "Don't say a thing. Right now you'll regret in daylight. Save it. Whatever it is, save it. There's work." He looked at her another moment. Then he nodded. Once, his nod, and he turned and walked back toward the house, and she stood at the edge of the burnt square with the bucket still in her hand. And she watched him go, and she thought, "You have a rule, Hannah May. You have a rule about kindness, and you have a rule about staying, and you have a rule about letting a man look at you the way that man just looked at you. Remember your rules." The rules had names. She had named them long ago, in the bad year after Tom died, when she had understood that the world was going to keep happening to her, whether she consented to it or not, and that the only thing she could control was how much of herself she handed over to it. The rules were simple. Never trust kindness, because kindness has a price tag, and you cannot afford it. Leave before you can be left, because leaving is the one dignity nobody can take from you. Do not be seen wanting anything, because wanting is what they use to break you. She had lived inside those rules for 12 years. They had kept her the way a fence keeps a herd, narrow but alive. And now, standing in the grey dawn, with the smell of burnt hay in her hair, and a man walking away from her across the yard who had almost said something she was not ready to hear, she felt the fence of her rules creak a little, the way her own fences creaked in a hard wind, and she did not know yet whether the fence would hold or whether something was going to come through it. She filed it away. She had work. They rebuilt the shed in 4 days. She did most of the framing herself because Silas had to ride into the county seat on the second day to file a complaint with the sheriff, which she had known before he left would come to nothing, and which had, in fact, come to nothing, the sheriff being a man Cyrus Latimer had helped elect, and a man who had explained to Silas with great regret that boot prints and a scrap of cloth did not make a case a grand jury would touch. Silas had come home at dusk on the second day, with his jaw set in a particular way, and a packet of nails and a new hasp for the shed door. And he had said only, "Sheriff sends his regrets." And she had said, "I'm sure he does." And they had not spoken of it again. Obadiah, who had been quiet through most of the rebuilding, came up to her on the 4th afternoon as she was setting the new door on its hinges, and he stood watching her line the pin and drop it home. And he said, "Mrs." She said, "Obadiah." He said, "I've been on this place 53 years. She said, "I know it." He said, "I knew his daddy. I knew his mama. I knew his Mary." She said, "I expect you did." He said, "I never seen him the way he is since you come." She set the second pin. She did not look at him. She said, "He's grieving." He said, "He was grieving before you come. He ain't grieving now. He's something else. I ain't got the word for it, but it ain't grieving." She said, "Obadiah." He said, "I ain't pushing, missus. I'm telling. There's a difference." She said, "There is." He said, "You ought to know what you're holding before you decide whether to put it down." She turned then and looked at him. The old man's face in the late light was the face of a man who had seen a great deal of weather and a great deal of foolishness, and was past being impressed by either. And his eyes were perfectly steady on hers, and she understood that he was, in his bent and ruined way, giving her a kindness, and she remembered her rule about kindness, and she let it through anyway, because some rules, she was beginning to think, were older than they were true. She said, "I hear you, Obadiah." He nodded. He said, "That's all I come to say." He walked back toward his cabin behind the barn, and she stood with the new door swinging easy on its hinges, and she watched him go. And the rule creaked again, the way old wire creaks, and she did not this time file it away. She let it sit. Latimer's next move came not with fire, but with paper. A man rode out from the county seat on a Tuesday, with a folded document in a leather case, and he was polite, and he was sorry. And he handed Silas a notice that the holder of the second mortgage on the Brennan place, which had been the bank, had sold that paper to a private party, and the private party was calling the note, "Full balance, due in 30 days. The private party was a holding concern out of Kansas City, whose ownership, if a person cared to dig 3 layers down, would have proven to belong to Cyrus Latimer. Silas read the notice standing on the porch. He read it twice. He folded it back into its envelope with hands that were perfectly steady, and he thanked the rider, and he watched the rider mount up and go, and then he turned and walked into the house without a word, and went into the room that had been his and Mary's bedroom, and shut the door. He did not come out for the rest of the afternoon. Hannah May did not knock. She understood, the way she understood weather, that there were rooms a person had to go into alone, and that the kindest thing another person could do was not stand outside the door asking after them. She made supper. She set 2 plates. She kept the food warm. When the sun went down, she lit the lamp, and she sat at the kitchen table and she waited. And at full dark, the bedroom door opened and Silas came out. He had washed his face. His eyes were red around the edges in the way of a man who has not cried but has come close. And he sat down across from her at the table, and he looked at the plate, and he said, "How much?" She said, "How much what?" He said, "How much is the note?" He told her the figure. It was a figure that would have bought the whole town of Ash Hollow twice. She said, "You don't have it." He said, "I don't have a tenth of it." She said, "The bank won't extend." He said, "The bank don't hold it anymore." That was the whole point. She said, 30 days. He said, 30 days. She said, "He'll offer to buy you out for the value of the note on day 29. He said, "He will." She said, "And you'll say." He looked up at her. He said, "I'll say no." She said, "Good." He said, "Good." She said, "Eat." He ate. They sat at the table a long time after the food was gone, the lamp between them, the night pressing in at the windows. And she thought about 30 days. And she thought about Cyrus Latimer. And she thought about a holding concern in Kansas City, 3 layers deep. And somewhere in the back of her mind, in the place where she kept the things she noted, a small quiet thought began to assemble itself, the way weather assembles on a far horizon before anybody on the ground knows a storm is coming. She said, "Silas." He said, "Yes." She said, "Who held the first mortgage?" He said, "The bank." "Still does. The first is current. The second is what he bought." She said, "Who held the second before the bank?" He said, "My father took it out in 78 against a man named Hollis Carver, who was a partner of his in a hay contract. Carver died in 81. The note passed to his estate. The estate sold it to the bank in 83. "Why?" She said, "Because if it passed through a private estate before it got to the bank, there'll be paper on it. There'll be the original instrument. And the original instrument, if your father was the kind of man I think he was, will have terms on it." She said, "Most private notes in those years had a clause about transfer, a clause that said the note could not be sold to a competing landholder in the same watershed without the consent of the debtor. It was a common clause, because in those years, water was the only thing worth fighting over, and everybody knew it. If that clause is in your father's note, Silas, and if it survived the transfer to the bank, then Latimer's purchase of that paper is void on its face." He stared at her. She said, "I am not a lawyer." He said, "You sound like one." She said, "I am a woman who watched her own husband's father lose a place to a man in 1879 over exactly that kind of clause. And I sat in the back of the courthouse for 3 days listening to the lawyers argue it. And I have not forgotten a word of it, because I was 16 and I was angry, and angry is the best diacre I ever had." He kept looking at her. He said, "You sat in that courthouse 3 days." She said, "In the back, in a black dress that didn't fit me because it was my mother's, with a notebook, because I had decided at 16 that if the world was going to keep doing things to women like me in rooms like that, I was at least going to know how the doing was done." He said, "Hannah May." She said, "Don't." He said, "Don't what?" She said, "Don't look at me like that. I need you to look at me like a man who has a problem, not like a man who has just realized something else. There will be time for the something else. There is not time for it now. There are 29 days. He said, "All right." She said, "Where are your father's papers?" He said, "In the trunk at the foot of the bed in the front room. I haven't opened it since he died." She said, "Open it tomorrow at first light. We will go through every sheet. If the original note is there, we have a chance. If it isn't, we will find out where it went, and we will go and get it," he said. "And if the clause isn't in it," she said, "then we will find another clause. There is always another clause. Men like your father wrote notes the way men like your father built fences. They put corners in them. We only have to find the corners." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "You scare me a little, Hannah May Whitlock," she said. "Good. Be scared of the right things. Latimer is one of them." "I am not." He almost smiled again. This time it reached his mouth. It was a small, tired thing, but it was a smile, and she saw it, and she filed it away with the rest, and she did not. This time, pretend she had not. They opened the trunk at first light. It was a cedar trunk, banded in iron, and the lid resisted at first, the way old things resist, and then it gave with a small breath of cedar and dust, and the particular sad smell of paper that has been folded a long time in the dark. Inside were the layers of a life, a folded flag, a bundle of letters tied in twine, a daguerreotype of a woman in a high collar who must have been Silas's mother, with a face that was Silas's face arranged differently, a child's tin whistle, a pair of spectacles in a velvet case, and underneath all of it, wrapped in oilcloth, a flat leather portfolio tied with a black ribbon. Silas lifted it out as if it might come apart in his hands. He set it on the kitchen table. He untied the ribbon. He opened the portfolio. Inside were perhaps 30 documents, each folded into thirds, each labeled on the outside in a careful copper-plate hand that had belonged, she understood, to Silas's father. Land patent, brand registration, marriage license, bills of sale for horses long since dead, and, near the bottom, a thicker document on heavier paper, labeled in the same careful hand, Note, Carver, 1878. Silas's hand hovered over it. He looked at her. She said, "Read it slow. Read every word. Read the words you think you understand twice." He unfolded it. He read it. She watched his face. His face did not change for a long time. And then, near the bottom of the second page, it changed. He read the line again. He looked up at her. He said, "It's here." She said, "Read it to me." He read it. "The note shall not be assigned, sold, or transferred to any party owning or claiming water rights upon the same drainage as the property securing said note, without the express written consent of the maker or his heirs." She closed her eyes for a moment. She opened them. She said, "There it is." He said, "There it is." She said, "Now we need the chain of transfer. Every assignment from Carver's estate to the bank to Latimer's holding concern. Every signature. Every date. If at any point in that chain anybody failed to obtain that consent, and they did, Silas, because nobody asked you, then the transfer to Latimer is void, and the note reverts." She said, "We need to be in the county seat by Friday." He said, "We will be." She said, "We need a lawyer who is not afraid of Cyrus Latimer." He said, "There is one. His name is Asa Goodnight, and he is 71 years old, and Latimer once tried to ruin him over a fence line and failed, and he has been waiting 9 years for a reason to put a boot on Latimer's neck." She said, "Then we have a lawyer." He said, "We have a lawyer." They rode into the county seat on Friday morning. She wore the navy dress because it was the only dress she had, but she had washed it and pressed it the night before, with a flat iron heated on the stove, and she had pinned her hair up properly with the tortoise-shell pins that had been her mother's, and she had polished her boots with lampblack and bacon grease until they shone. And when she came out onto the porch in the dawn, Silas had looked at her once and looked away and said only, "We should go," in a voice that was a little rougher than it had been a minute before. Asa Goodnight kept an office above the dry goods store on the main street, up a flight of outside stairs that complained under their boots. He was a small man with white hair like dandelion seed and eyes the pale, clear blue of certain January mornings. And he listened to them for 40 minutes without interrupting. And at the end of the 40 minutes, he took off his spectacles and polished them with a handkerchief and put them back on and said, "Mrs. Whitlock." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Where did you study law?" She said, "I didn't, sir. I sat in the back of a courtroom in Pawnee County in 1879, and I listened." He said, "You listened well." She said, "I had reason to." He said, "We are going to file in the morning. We are going to file for a declaratory judgment that the assignment of the Carver note to the Latimer concern is void ab initio for want of consent. We are going to ask for an emergency hearing inside the 30-day window, because the calling of the note is imminent and irreparable. The judge is a man named Harlan Pruitt, who does not love Cyrus Latimer, because Cyrus Latimer once outbid him on a stallion, in a way Pruitt considered ungentlemanly, and Pruitt is a man who remembers ungentlemanly behavior, the way most men remember their own birthdays. We will have our hearing inside 10 days. He looked at Silas. He said, "Mr. Brennan." Silas said, "Sir." Goodnight said, "You have been carrying this alone a long time." Silas said, "I have." Goodnight said, "You are not carrying it alone anymore." He looked at Hannah May when he said it. She did not look away. She did not nod. She only held his pale blue gaze the way a person holds a cup that has been handed to them full to the brim, careful not to spill. And after a moment, Goodnight smiled, a small, dry old man's smile, and he said, "Go home. Mend your fences. I will send word." They rode home in the long gold afternoon, with the cottonwoods turning at the edges, and the smell of cured grass in the air, and the first thin coolness under the heat that meant September was going to give way, soon, to something else. They did not speak much. There was not much that needed saying. Somewhere west of the county line, a flock of blackbirds lifted off a fence in one body and turned in the air and settled again. And Silas watched them and said, without looking at her, Mary used to call those the Lord's handwriting. Said the way they moved together was a sentence, and if you were quiet enough, you could almost read it. Hannah May said, "What do you think it said?" He was quiet a while. He said, "I think it said the same thing over and over. I think it said, 'Look up, look up, look up.'" She did not answer that. There was no answer to it. That would not have been too much. They rode on. The news of the filing reached Cyrus Latimer inside of 2 days, because news of that kind always did, and his response came inside of 3. It came in the form of a man at the gate at dusk on a Monday, a man Hannah May had not seen before, lean and quiet, with a face that had been arranged a long time ago to show nothing. And he sat his horse at the cattle guard, and he did not come up to the house, only sat there until Silas walked down to meet him with the rifle in the crook of his arm. They spoke for perhaps 3 minutes. The man did not dismount. Silas did not invite him to. At the end of the 3 minutes, the man touched his hat and turned his horse and rode out. And Silas walked back up to the porch with his face set the way it had been set the night of the fire. And he leaned the rifle against the wall, and he sat down on the top step beside her, and he said, "He offered me the value of the note plus 2,000 to drop the suit and sell. She said, and you said. He said, I said no. She said, and then. He said, and then. He said it would be a shame if anything happened to the woman who was advising me, because she struck him as the kind of woman who walked alone after dark, and the country was rough. He said it that way, polite, like a weather report. She did not move. She had known, sitting on the step in the dusk with the first cool of evening on her arms, that something like this was coming, because men like Latimer did not have very many tools, and the ones they had they used in a predictable order. She said, "What did you say to that?" He said, "I told him if anything happened to her, anything at all, even a turned ankle, I would come for Cyrus Latimer personally, and I would not come with a lawyer." She said, "Silas." He said, "I meant it." She said, "I know you did. That's what worries me." He said, "Don't ask me to take it back." She said, "I'm not going to ask you to take it back. I'm going to ask you not to do it. Those are not the same thing." He looked at her. He said, "You are asking me to let a man threaten you and do nothing." She said, "I am asking you to let a man threaten me and do the thing that ends him." Doing the thing that ends him is not riding to his house with a rifle. Doing the thing that ends him is standing in Harlan Pruitt's courtroom in 9 days, with Asa, Goodnight at one elbow, and me at the other, and a folder full of paper that makes him a liar and a fool in front of every man in this county whose opinion he has spent 20 years buying. That is how you end him, Silas. Not with a bullet, with a verdict. He was quiet a long time. The light went out of the sky in stages, the way it does in September, blue and then grey, and then that particular soft lavender that does not last more than a few minutes before the dark comes down. And somewhere out in the pasture, an owl spoke once and was answered. And Silas finally said, "You are the most dangerous woman I have ever known, Hannah May Whitlock." She said, "I am not dangerous. I am only patient." "There is a difference," he said, "not from where I'm sitting." She did not answer that. She sat with him in the dusk until the stars came up over the eastern ridge, 1 and 2 at a time, and neither of them moved. And after a long while, his hand, which had been resting on his knee, moved over and covered hers where it rested on the step between them. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. His hand was warm and heavy and rough, and it stayed there, and she did not pull hers away. And she felt the rule about kindness creak hard inside her, and she felt it bend, and she felt it. Not break exactly, but give, the way wire gives when you have stretched it past where it wanted to go. And she sat with her hand under his, and she breathed, and she did not file it away. She let it be what it was. After a while he said, "I am not asking you for anything." She said, "I know." He said, "I want you to know I am not asking." She said, "I know, Silas." He said, "All right." He took his hand back. He stood up. He picked up the rifle. He said, "Lock your door tonight." She said, "I will." She locked her door. She did not sleep much. She lay on the narrow bed in the room off the kitchen, with the tobacco tin on the windowsill and the moon coming in white across the floor. And she thought about her rules. And she thought about the warmth of his hand. And she thought about a man in a dusk saying, "I am not asking." And she understood, lying there, that the most generous thing a person had ever said to her in her life was a sentence about not asking. And she understood also that she had spent so much of her life braced for being asked for things she could not give that she had never considered what it would feel like to be in a room with a person who would not ask. It felt like a window opening in a room she had not known was a room. She slept finally an hour before dawn. She dreamed of cottonwoods turning silver, The week before the hearing was the longest week of her life and also, somehow, the shortest. She mended fence, she fed horses, she rebuilt the rotten step on the back porch, she cooked, and Silas ate, and Obadiah brought his coffee cup in the mornings and left it on the rail, and the world went on doing the small ordinary things the world does when it is not paying attention to the fact that somewhere a hearing is being prepared. Asa Goodnight sent word twice by a boy on a sorrel pony, brief notes in his careful hand. The first said, "Hearing set, Thursday next, 10 of the clock, Judge Pruitt presiding." The second said, "Bring the original note, bring the woman." She read that second note twice. She folded it and put it in the pocket of her apron, and she stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the cottonwoods. And she said out loud to the empty kitchen, "Bring the woman." And she laughed once, a short, hard, surprised laugh, because nobody in her entire life had ever written a sentence with her in it that meant "bring her," because we need her. The sentences had always meant the other thing. She wiped her eyes with the corner of the apron, although she had not, she told herself, been crying, and she went back to the bread she was kneading, and she punched it down harder than it needed, and she let that be the end of it. The day before the hearing, Cyrus Latimer made his last move. He made it in town in broad daylight on the steps of the courthouse, where he knew there would be witnesses, because men like Cyrus Latimer always made their cruelest moves where there would be witnesses, the witnesses being the point. Silas and Hannah Moe had ridden in to meet with Asa Goodnight one last time and to go over their testimony, and they were coming down the courthouse steps in the late morning with the folder under Silas's arm, and Latimer was coming up the steps with two men at his shoulders, and he stopped on the middle step so that they could not pass without going around him, and he tipped his hat, and he smiled the smile that was all teeth and no eyes, and he said loud enough for the 6 men loitering on the courthouse lawn to hear him clearly, "Mr. Brennan, Mrs. Whitlock, I see you've brought your fat little fence woman to court with you. I do hope the judge has reinforced his chairs." The lawn went quiet. 2 of the loiterers laughed, the small, uncertain laugh of men who are not sure yet which way to laugh and are hedging. Silas's hand tightened on the folder until his knuckles went white, and Hannah May, without looking at him, without even turning her head, put her hand on his wrist and pressed once, firmly, the way a person presses the shoulder of a horse to tell it to stand. She felt him still. She lifted her eyes to Cyrus Latimer's face. She did not raise her voice. She did not change her expression. She said, "Mr. Latimer," he said. "Ma'am," she said, "in the morning, in Judge Pruitt's courtroom, you and I are going to find out which of us the chair was built for. I suggest you save your remarks about furniture until then." The 2 laughing men stopped laughing. One of the men at Latimer's shoulder made a small sound that might have been a cough and might have been a snort, and Latimer's smile slipped a 1/4 inch and was hauled back into place, and Hannah May stepped around him on the step, calm as Sunday, and walked down to the street with Silas behind her. And she did not look back, and she did not, although her knees were trembling inside the navy dress, allow her stride to alter by so much as an inch. They reached the buckboard. Silas helped her up. He climbed up beside her. He picked up the reins. He did not move the team. He sat staring straight ahead at the rump of the off-horse, and then, slowly, his shoulders began to shake, and for a moment she thought he was crying, and then she realized he was laughing. a low, silent, helpless laugh that he was trying very hard to contain and failing. And he turned his face to her finally, with tears in the corners of his eyes from the effort of it, and he said, "Which of us the chair was built for?" "Hannah May." She said, "He started it." He said, "You finished it." She said, "Not yet. Tomorrow I finish it." He looked at her a long moment, and the laugh went out of him slowly, and was replaced by something quieter and steadier and harder to name. And he said, "Hannah May." She said, "Drive the team, Silas. People are watching." He drove the team. They went home. They did not speak much on the road. There was a kind of silence between them now that was new. A silence that was not the careful silence of two hollowed-out people avoiding each other's wounds, but a different silence, a silence with weight in it, a silence that was holding something between them in trust until there was time to set it down properly and look at it. She felt it the whole way home. She did not file it away. She carried it in her lap like a bowl of water she did not want to spill. The courtroom on Thursday morning was full. It was full because word of the hearing had spread the way word spreads in small counties. And it was full because Cyrus Latimer had enemies who wanted to watch and friends who wanted to be seen watching. And it was full because the story of the fat fence woman and the grieving rancher and the holding concern in Kansas City had become, in the week since the filing, the only story anyone in 3 counties wanted to tell. Hannah May walked in on Silas's arm in the navy dress, with her hair up and her boots shining, and she felt every eye in the room land on her, and she did not flinch, and she did not lower her gaze, and she walked down the center aisle to the table where Asa Goodnight was waiting with his papers spread, and she sat down in the chair he pulled out for her, and the chair held her, as chairs had always held her, because chairs were built for people, and she was a person, and she folded her hands on the table in front of her, and she waited. Judge Harlan Pruitt came in at 10 of the clock exactly. He was a heavy man with a white mustache and the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had decided a long time ago that hurry was beneath him. He sat. He looked over the courtroom. His eyes rested for a moment on Cyrus Latimer, sitting at the opposing table in a coat that had cost more than most men in the room made in a year, and his eyes did not warm. They rested next on Asa Goodnight, and warmed a degree. They rested last on Hannah May, and she felt them weigh her, not the way the banker had weighed her, but the way a man weighs a tool he is considering picking up, and she met the weighing without blinking, and Judge Pruitt, after a moment, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod that might have meant nothing and might have meant everything, and he said, "We are here on the matter of Brennan versus Cimarron Holdings. Mr. Goodnight." Asa Goodnight rose. He spoke for 18 minutes. He spoke the way he had listened in his office, without hurry, without ornament, without raising his voice once. And he laid out the chain of the note from Carver to Carver's estate, to the bank, to the Latimer concern. And he laid out the clause, and he laid out the failure of consent. And at the end of the 18 minutes, he turned to the table where Silas and Hannah May sat, and he said, "Your Honor, the petitioner wishes the court to hear from a witness who can speak to the practice and custom of such consent clauses in this territory in the years in question, and who first identified the defect in the chain of assignment. Your Honor, the petitioner calls Mrs. Hannah May Whitlock." There was a small stir in the courtroom. The opposing counsel, a slick young man out of Kansas City who had been brought down on the train, half rose from his chair and said, "Your Honor, with all respect, The witness is not a member of the bar, nor a recognized expert in property law, nor, so far as the record reflects, possessed of any formal training whatsoever in matters of conveyancing. We object to her testimony as lacking foundation. Judge Pruitt looked at him. The look took perhaps 4 seconds and contained a number of opinions Judge Pruitt did not bother to translate into words. He said, "Counsel, I will decide what foundation this witness has after she has spoken, not before. Sit down. Mrs. Whitlock, come forward." She rose. She walked to the witness chair. She put her hand on the Bible the bailiff held out, and she swore the oath in a voice that was clear and unhurried, and she sat, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. Asa Goodnight stood to the side of his table where she could see him plain. He said, "Mrs. Whitlock, please state your name and place of residence," she said. "Hannah May Whitlock. I reside at present at the Brennan Ranch in Brennan's Draw, in this county." He said, "And before that," she said, "I resided in Ash Hollow for 3 weeks, and before that on a 40-acre place east of the Cimarron that I lost to the bank in May of this year, and before that on the same place with my husband Thomas Whitlock for 11 years until his death." He said, "And your occupation?" She said, "I have done the work of a smallholder all my life. I have mended fence, run cattle, broken horses, kept books, cured meat, midwifed calves, and raised a garden that fed a road. I have read every legal document that touched my husband's land or my father's land or my own. And I have sat in the back of a courthouse in Pawnee County in the year 1879 and listened to 3 days of argument over a consent clause in a private note that bore close resemblance to the one before this court." He said, "Why did you sit in that courthouse?" She said, "Because the note in question had been my father-in-law's, and the consent clause in it had been ignored, and a man named Burchard had taken the place where my husband had been born by buying the paper and calling it due. And I wanted to understand how a thing like that was done so that it couldn't be done to me." He said, "And was Burchard's purchase upheld or struck down?" She said, "Struck down, voided ab initio." The court found that a consent clause in a private instrument running with the land was a covenant the assignee took subject to, and that failure to obtain consent rendered the assignment a nullity. Mr. Burchard was ordered to reconvey the note to the estate. The calling of the note was vacated, and my husband's people kept their place for another 9 years, until the drought of '88 took it the honest way. There was a small sound from the courtroom, not quite a murmur, the sound of a room of men adjusting their assumptions in unison. Asa Goodnight allowed a small pause. He said, "Mrs. Whitlock, you have read the note executed by Hollis Carver in favor of the elder Mr. Brennan in 1878. She said, "I have." He said, "You have read the clause at the bottom of the 2nd page." She said, "I have." He said, "Read it aloud for the court, if you would." She read it. She read it in the same clear, unhurried voice in which she had taken the oath, and she did not stumble on any word. And when she came to the phrase, "without the express written consent of the maker or his heirs," she let the phrase sit in the air for a heartbeat before she went on. And she felt the room receive it the way dry ground receives the first rain. He said, "And in the chain of assignments before this court, do you find any record of the express written consent of Silas Brennan, the surviving heir, to the transfer of this note to Cimarron Holdings?" She said, "I do not." He said, "Was Mr. Brennan asked?" She said he was not. He said, "Would he have given consent had he been asked?" The opposing counsel was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor," Speculation. Judge Pruitt said, sustained as to consent. Rephrase, counsel. Asa Goodnight inclined his head a quarter inch. He said, Mrs. Whitlock, in your experience reading such instruments in this territory, what is the customary purpose of a consent clause running against a competing landholder in the same watershed? She said, to prevent the very thing that is being attempted in this case, to prevent a neighbor with deeper pockets and an interest in the debtor's water from acquiring the debtor's paper for the purpose of forcing a foreclosure and absorbing the land. The clause exists because in the 70s and 80s, men learned by hard example that whoever held the second note held the throat of the place, and that an honest debtor could be ruined inside a season by the simple device of selling his paper to his enemy. The clause was written to make that device unlawful. He said, in the present case, Your Honor, the device has been attempted. We ask the court to find, as the Pawnee Court found in 79, that the assignment is void on its face, that the note reverts to the prior holder, and that the calling of the note by Cimarron Holdings is a nullity. He said, no further questions of this witness at this time. Judge Pruitt looked at the opposing counsel. He said, cross. The opposing counsel stood. He was a young man with a careful part in his hair and a watch chain across his vest that had been polished that morning, and he came around his table with the small swagger of a man who had been told repeatedly that he was clever and had decided to believe it, and he stopped 6 feet from her, and he smiled. Mrs. Whitlock, he said. She said, sir. He said, you are not a lawyer. She said, I am not. He said, you have no formal education in the law. She said, I have not. He said, you sat, by your own account, in the back of a courtroom for 3 days at the age of 16. She said, I did. He said, and on the strength of that experience, you come before this court today and presume to instruct His Honor on the law of consent clauses in the territory of which His Honor is a duly appointed judge of 15 years standing. She said, I do not presume to instruct His Honor on anything. His Honor knows the law of this territory better than I ever will. I was asked what I had read and what I had heard. I have answered. If His Honor wishes me to stop answering, His Honor will tell me so. Judge Pruitt, without looking up from the paper in front of him, said, His Honor does not wish her to stop answering. Proceed, counsel. The opposing counsel's color came up half a shade. He said, Mrs. Whitlock, she said, sir. He said, is it not true that you have a personal interest in the outcome of this case? She said, I have a personal interest in the outcome of every case I have ever been in or near. So do you. He said, I beg your pardon. She said, you are paid to win. I am paid by a man whose place I live on. We both have interests. The question is whether the interests have made us liars. I have not lied today. I have read you the clause, and I have told you what court I sat in and what I heard there. If any single word I have spoken is untrue, you are welcome to point to it. He stood for a moment. He did not point to any word. He said instead, Mrs. Whitlock, what is the precise nature of your relationship to Mr. Silas Brennan? The courtroom went still. Asa, Goodnight, half rose. Judge Pruitt lifted one finger from the desk, and Asa Goodnight sat back down. The judge looked at the opposing counsel. He said, Counsel, tread carefully. The opposing counsel said, Your Honor, the witness's bias goes to weight. I'm entitled to explore the nature of the witness's interest. Judge Pruitt said, You are entitled. You are not entitled to wallow. Ask the question once. Mrs. Whitlock will answer. and we will move on." Hannah May looked at the young man with the polished watch chain. She let him stand there a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she said, "Mr. Brennan hired me on the 18th of August to mend 3 miles of broken fence on his south line for the wage of $1 per day and board. The fence was on inspection, also being cut by persons unknown, and the mending of it became a longer task than 3 days. He has kept me on at the same wage, to continue the work and to do such other work about the place as needs doing, which has included rebuilding a hay shed that was burned in September by a man hired with somebody's money, repairing a barn roof, cutting and stacking a hay crop, and reading the contents of a cedar trunk that had not been opened in 11 years. I sleep in the room off the kitchen that was his mother's. I take my meals at his table. He has not asked me for anything I have not freely given, and he has not given me anything I have not earned. That is the precise nature of my relationship to Mr. Silas Brennan. Is there anything in that account, sir, that you would like me to repeat?" The opposing counsel did not, it turned out, want anything repeated. He said, "No further questions," and he went back to his table and sat down, and Cyrus Latimer beside him did not look at him, and the small distance between their chairs grew, somehow, larger, without either of them moving. Judge Pruitt said, "You may step down, Mrs. Whitlock." She stepped down. She walked back to the petitioner's table. She sat. Silas, beside her, did not turn his head, but his hand, under the table, found hers in her lap and pressed it once and let it go. Asa Goodnight rose and made his closing argument in 7 minutes. The opposing counsel made his in 22 and lost the room somewhere around minute 9 and never got it back. Judge Pruitt took no recess. He sat for perhaps a minute after the arguments closed, looking at the papers in front of him with the same unhurried gravity with which he did everything, and then he lifted his head and he said, "The court finds that the consent clause contained in the Carver Note of 1878 is a valid covenant running with the instrument. The court finds that the assignment of said note from the First Territorial Bank to Cimarron Holdings was effected without the express written consent of the surviving heir, Silas Brennan, as required by the express terms of the instrument. The court finds, accordingly, that said assignment is void ab initio. The note reverts to the prior holder. The calling of the note by Cimarron Holdings is vacated and of no effect. Costs to the petitioner." He set his pen down. He said, "We are adjourned." The gavel came down. The courtroom rose. Hannah May did not stand for a moment, because her legs had decided, again without consulting her, that they would prefer to sit a little longer, and Silas remained beside her, and Asa Goodnight, on her other side, leaned in close and said quietly, in a voice meant for her alone, "Mrs. Whitlock, in 51 years of the practice of law, I have not seen a finer witness sit in that chair," she said. "Mr. Goodnight, I am about to cry, and I will not do it in this room. Will you walk us out?" he said. "It would be my honor." He walked them out. Cyrus Latimer was already gone. He had risen the moment the gavel fell and walked out a side door without speaking to his counsel, and the men who had come into the courtroom that morning to be seen at his shoulder were, somehow, no longer at his shoulder when he went, and his exit had been observed by every man in the room, and the observation had been entered into a ledger no clerk would ever write down, but that every man in the county would carry in his head for the rest of his life. They stepped out of the courthouse into the noon light. The lawn was full of men. Some of them touched their hats to her. Two of them, men she had never seen before, came up and asked if they might shake her hand, and she gave it, and they shook it solemnly, as if she were a candidate for an office she had not run for. And one of them, a thin old farmer, with a face like a piece of harness leather, held her hand a moment longer and said, "Ma'am, my daddy lost a place in 76 on a clause like that one. Nobody read it for him. I just want to say, he couldn't finish what he wanted to say. He let go of her hand and touched his hat and walked away. And she stood on the courthouse steps, with the sun on her face and Silas at her elbow, and Asa Goodnight beside her. And she understood, in a way she had not understood standing on those same steps the day before with Cyrus Latimer's words on her, that the courthouse steps were not, after all, only a place where cruelty happened to women like her. They were also sometimes a place where something else happened. They drove home in the long blue afternoon. The cottonwoods along the road had turned, in the days since she had last noticed them, from green to a yellow so bright it seemed to make its own light, and the air had the first true coolness in it of the autumn to come, and a flock of geese went over them high up, going south, calling to one another in the way geese call. And Silas, watching them go, said, without taking his eyes off the sky, Mary used to say the geese were the year saying goodbye to itself. Hannah May said, she had a sentence for everything, didn't she? He said, she did. She said, I would have liked her. He said, she would have liked you. He said it without thinking about it, and then he thought about it, and he did not take it back. He drove the team. She sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the geese go out of sight over the southern ridge, and she did not file the sentence away. She let it stay where he had set it down, between them on the seat of the buckboard, and she carried it home that way, gently, the way she had carried the silence home from town the week before. Obadiah was on the porch when they pulled into the yard. He had a cup of coffee in his hand and another one sitting on the rail under a saucer, and he stood up as they came up the steps, and he handed the second cup to Hannah May without a word, and she took it, and he looked at Silas, and he said, well. Silas said, well. Obadiah said, did she eat him? Silas said, she ate him. Obadiah said, whole. Silas said, without salt. Obadiah grinned the yellow ruined grin, and he said, Mrs. She said, Obadiah. He said, you drink that coffee. You earned it. You go on and sit down. He sat her down in the rocking chair on the porch, and he went into the house, and she heard him in the kitchen banging pots in the particular way old men bang pots when they are determined to be useful and have not been in a kitchen in some years. And she sat in the rocking chair with the cup warm in her hands, and Silas on the top step with his elbows on his knees. And the sun went down slow over the western ridge, and neither of them said anything for a long while, and after a while she understood that they were not going to need to. The aftermath came in pieces over the next 2 weeks, the way aftermath does. Cyrus Latimer was seen, 3 days after the hearing, boarding the eastbound train at the county seat with 2 trunks and a ticket. The station master reported was for St. Louis. His ranch, it was said, was to be managed in his absence by a cousin nobody had heard of, and the cousin, it was said further, had instructions to entertain offers. The holding concern in Kansas City was, by the end of October, the subject of 3 other suits in 3 other counties, none of which Cyrus Latimer was in the territory to defend. The sheriff who had explained to Silas that boot prints and a scrap of cloth would not make a case was, in the next election, opposed and beaten by a deputy named Eli Booker, who had been quietly furious about the hayshed for 2 months and had told 3 people he intended to run on that fury alone. The bank manager who had taken Hannah May's 40 acres in May rode out to the Brennan place on a Tuesday in the second week of October, hat in hand, and stood in the yard and asked to speak with her. She came out onto the porch. She did not invite him up. He stood in the dust with his hat in his hands, and he said, "Mrs. Whitlock," she said. "Mr. Hennessy," he said, "I have come to apologize." She did not answer. He said, "I spoke to you in May in a manner that was not befitting of a man in my position, nor of a man at all, and I have thought on it since, and the thinking has not gone in my favor. I am sorry." She let him stand a moment in the dust. She said, "Mr. Hennessy," he said. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "You did not come here to apologize because you have grown a conscience. You came here to apologize because you heard what happened in Judge Pruitt's courtroom, and you have begun to suspect that the verdict in your bank's manner of doing business with widows is going to be the next verdict written in this county. I will accept your apology. I will not pretend that I do not understand what brought it. Go home, Mr. Hennessy. Do better. Tell the next widow what her papers say." He said, "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Thank you, ma'am." He put his hat on. He turned. He mounted his horse. He rode out. And she watched him go down the long drive in the gold afternoon. And she felt nothing in particular about him, which was, she understood, its own kind of progress. There had been a time, not very long ago, when she would have carried the small, bright satisfaction of his apology around in her chest for a week, turning it over the way a child turns a coin. She did not now. She let him go down the drive. She let the apology be what it was. She went back into the kitchen and finished the bread she had been kneading when he rode in, and she did not, even once, look out the window again to see how far he had got. Mrs. Bell came on a Thursday. She came in a borrowed wagon, driven by her oldest boy, and she had with her a covered basket and an expression Hannah May had never seen on her face before, which was the expression of a woman who had decided, in the privacy of her own kitchen, to do a thing she did not want to do, and had come to do it anyway, because not doing it had become unbearable. Hannah May met her in the yard. Mrs. Bell got down from the wagon with the basket in her hands, and she stood for a moment looking at the porch and the white curtains in the windows and the barn with its new roof on the east side, and she said, "You have made it pretty here." Hannah May said, "It was already pretty. I only washed the curtains." Mrs. Bell said, "That is not all you did." She held out the basket. She said, "I brought you a pie. It is rhubarb." "I do not know if you care for rhubarb." Hannah May said, "I care for rhubarb." She took the basket. Mrs. Bell stood in the yard with her empty hands, and she did not seem to know what to do with them. And finally, she put them in the pockets of her apron, and she said, "Mrs. Whitlock." Hannah May said, "Yes." Mrs. Bell said, "When you slept in my loft, I let you sleep there for the work of the water. I did not let you sleep there for the company of it. I want you to know that I knew at the time that I was charging you more than the water was worth, and that I told myself it was a fair exchange because the loft was empty and the water was heavy, and I have come out here to tell you that it was not a fair exchange, and I am sorry for it. I am going to send you by my boy the difference in laundry credit or in coin as you prefer. And I am going to do it not because anybody is making me, but because I would like to be able to look at my own face in a mirror when I am brushing my hair at night, and at the moment I cannot." Hannah May looked at her a long moment. She said, "Mrs. Bell." Mrs. Bell said, "Yes." Hannah May said, "Keep your money." Mrs. Bell said, "But." Hannah May said, "Keep your money. Send the laundry credit, if you like, to the next woman who comes through Ash Hollow with a carpet bag and nowhere to put it down. Tell her the loft is free. Tell her there is a stove and a candle and as much water as she can carry. And tell her she does not owe you a thing for it. Do that for 10 women, Mrs. Bell. And you and I will be square, and you will be able to look at your face in your mirror for the rest of your life. And you will have done more good in the bargain than my pride could ever have squeezed out of you." Mrs. Bell stood in the yard a moment. Her eyes filled. She did not let the tears fall. She said, "You are a hard woman, Mrs. Whitlock." Hannah May said, "I am not hard. I am only fair. There is a difference." Mrs. Bell got back in the wagon. Her boy turned the team. They went down the drive, and Hannah May stood on the porch with the basket in her hands, and she watched them go, and she thought, 10 women. She thought, that is a thing worth having traded a loft for. She took the pie inside. She set it on the kitchen table. She cut 3 pieces, one for Silas, and one for Obadiah, and one for herself. And that night after supper, they ate them on the porch with coffee. And Obadiah, who was a man who had opinions about pie, took 2 bites and closed his eyes and said, "Mrs., that is a pie." And Silas said, "It is." And Hannah May said, "Mrs. Bell brought it." And the 2 men looked at her, and she said, "She came to apologize." Obadiah said, "Did you let her?" Hannah May said, "I let her keep her money and send the loft to 10 other women." Obadiah said, "That is a hard trade." Hannah May said, "It is the only trade worth making." Silas did not say anything. He ate his pie. After a while, he said, "Quiet. You have changed this place," she said. The place was already here. He said, "I do not mean the curtains." She said, "I know what you mean." She did not say anything else. He did not press. They sat on the porch in the cool autumn dark until the coffee was gone, and the stars had come up thick across the sky. And Obadiah finally stood and stretched and said, "Mrs. Sir," and went off toward his cabin. And they were alone on the porch, the way they had been the night his hand had found hers on the step. Silas did not move toward her. She did not move toward him. The space between them on the porch had a particular weight to it that she had stopped trying to file away. And after a long while, he said, without looking at her, "Hannah May." She said yes. He said, "When the note is signed back over, and the paper is clean, and the place is mine again proper, there is a thing I would like to ask you, not tonight. When the paper is clean. I want it to be clean when I ask." She said, "All right." He said, "You do not have to know now what your answer is." She said, "I know." He said, "I only wanted you to know there was going to be a question." She said, "Silas." He said, "Yes." She said, "There is going to be an answer." He looked at her then. The lamp inside the kitchen window threw a small square of yellow across the porch boards, and his face was half in it and half out of it, and she could see one of his eyes plain, and the other only as a shape, and the one she could see was steady on her, and she did not look away. He said, "All right." She said, "All right." That was the extent of it. He stood up after a while and said good night and went into the house, and she sat on the porch alone a little longer, with her hands in her lap. And she thought about the rule she had carried for 12 years, leave before you can be left. And she turned it over in her head, the way she had used to turn coins in her tobacco tin. And she found, examining it carefully in the dark, that it had got smaller. It had not gone. She did not believe it would ever entirely go. but it had got small enough that she could, for the first time in 12 years, see around the edges of it to the country on the other side. And the country on the other side was a porch in autumn, with a man in it who had said there was going to be a question, and she sat with the smallness of the rule for a long time before she went to bed. The paper was clean by the 1st of November. Asa Goodnight sent it out by the same boy on the same sorrel pony, a thick envelope sealed with red wax, and Silas opened it at the kitchen table, with Hannah May across from him and Obadiah leaning in the doorway with a cup of coffee. And he read each page slowly, and at the end he set the last page down on top of the others, and he flattened them with his palm, and he said, "It is done." Obadiah said, "Hallelujah." Silas said, "The note is back with the bank. The bank has agreed to a 10-year extension at 4% on account of the conduct of the prior assignee." Asa says they were eager to agree. Asa says the word he used in his letter to them was eager. Obadiah said, "I bet he did." Silas said, "The place is mine, properly, clean. There is no paper on it that anybody else can use." He said it the way he said everything, without ornament. But his voice, when he said the word clean, had a small catch in it that she had not heard before, and she understood that for a man who had spent 2 months sleeping under the threat of losing the ground his father had broken with his own hands, the word clean was not a small word. She said, "Silas." He said, "Yes." She said, "Congratulations." He looked up at her. He said, "Hannah May." She said, "I know, not tonight." "When the moment is the moment," he said, "all right." Obadiah, in the doorway, looked from one of them to the other, and his old yellow grin spread across his beard, and he said nothing at all, because Obadiah Pike, having lasted 70 years on the Brennan place, knew when a man and a woman needed a room cleared, and he cleared it. He said, "I'm going to look at that mare's foot." He went. He took his coffee with him. The kitchen was quiet for a moment after the door closed and the lamp ticked, and the bread on the counter under its cloth gave off the small good smell of dough that was almost ready to bake. And Silas looked across the table at her, and he did not say the thing he had said he was going to say, not yet, because he was a man who kept his word about timing too, and instead he said, "Will you walk down to the creek with me?" She said, "Now." He said, "Now." She said, "All right." They walked. The afternoon was cold and bright, with that particular hard November light that makes everything look as if it has been cut out of tin. And the cottonwoods along the creek had dropped most of their leaves, and the leaves were thick underfoot, and they crackled as she and Silas walked over them in the silence of 2 people who had decided in advance not to fill the silence with talk for talk's sake. They came to the bend where the creek made a shallow pool under a leaning sycamore, and Silas stopped, and Hannah May stopped beside him, and he stood looking at the water a while before he spoke. He said, "This is where I asked Mary." She did not answer. He said, "I'm not telling you that to make it strange. I am telling you because I want you to know I have thought about whether it would be strange, and I have decided that the only way a place becomes strange is if you let it. This is where I asked Mary, because this is the prettiest place on the property, and I am not going to let a piece of ground I love be ruined for the rest of my life by what I am about to do." She said, "Silas." He said, "Hannah May Whitlock." She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm not going to ask you to marry me today. I'm going to ask you that another day, when you have had time to know it is coming and to know what you want to do with it. What I'm going to ask you today is something smaller, and I would like you to think about it on its own and not as a step toward the other thing. although I will not pretend it is not. She said, "All right," he said, "stay." She did not speak for a moment. He said, "I'm not asking you to stay as my wife. I'm not asking you to stay as my hired hand. I'm asking you to stay as a person who lives here because she belongs here, and we will work out the names of things as we go. The room off the kitchen is yours for as long as you want it. The $1 a day is yours for as long as you want it, although I will tell you plainly that the $1 a day has felt like an insult to me for about 6 weeks now, and I would like to find a better arrangement when you are ready to talk about one. The place is yours to keep mending, and I am yours to keep mending if you have a mind, although I understand if you do not, because I am a project that does not promise quick returns. Stay. That is what I am asking. Not tonight. Not for an answer tonight. Just hear the asking and carry it home with you, and tell me when you know." She stood with her hands in the pockets of the coat he had given her 3 weeks before, when the weather turned. A coat that had been his, and that he had cut down at the shoulders to fit her, sitting up 2 nights at the kitchen table, with a needle in his big, careful hands. And she felt the weight of the coat on her shoulders, and she felt the weight of the asking in the air between them. And she thought, "This is the moment," she thought, "this is the moment all my rules were built to keep me from." She thought, "You can leave now. You can leave before he leaves you. You can walk back up to the house and pack the carpet bag and the tobacco tin, and you can be on the road to anywhere by sundown, and you will be safe, and you will be alone, and you will be exactly what you have been for 12 years, which is a woman who did not allow herself to want anything she could not survive losing. She thought, "That is one road," she thought. "The other road is to open your mouth right now and say the word you have not allowed yourself to say in 12 years, which is yes." She did not file the choice away. She let it stand in front of her in the bright cold light, by the creek, with the cottonwood leaves crackling underfoot, and the small pool catching the sky and reflecting it back, broken into pieces of silver. And she looked at Silas Brennan, who had taken his hat off when he started to speak, and was holding it in front of him in both hands the way a man holds a hat at a funeral or a wedding or any other moment, when he is in the presence of a thing larger than himself. And she said, "Silas." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm going to say something that is not the answer to your question, and then I'm going to say something that is." He said, "All right." She said, "I have a rule. I have carried it 12 years. The rule is leave before you can be left. The rule has kept me alive through a number of things that would otherwise have killed me. I am not going to pretend I have set it down. I am going to tell you that I have, in the last 2 months, begun to suspect that the rule was never the wisdom I thought it was. I think the rule was only fear with a uniform on. I think I have been carrying fear around in the shape of a principle, because fear is easier to obey than to argue with. I am telling you this because I owe you the truth of it before I answer your question, because the answer will only mean what it is supposed to mean if you know what is standing behind it." He said, "I am listening." She said, "The other thing I'm going to say is the answer." He waited. She said, "Yes." He did not move for a moment. Then he said, "Hannah May." She said, "I will stay. I will stay as the person who lives here because she belongs here. We will work out the names of things as we go. I will stay tonight, and I will stay tomorrow, and I will stay through the winter, and I will be on this porch in the spring when the cottonwoods come back, And I will be on it in the summer when they go silver in the wind, and I will be on it next autumn when the leaves turn. And you will not have to ask me again about the staying, because the staying is settled, and we will only have to talk, from here on, about the other questions, the smaller ones and the larger ones, and we will talk about them in their own time. That is my answer." He put his hat back on. He did it slowly, and his hands were not, she saw, perfectly steady. And that was the first time she had ever seen Silas Brennan's hands not be perfectly steady. And she filed that, finally, away. Because some things deserve to be filed away as treasures rather than as warnings. And she understood, watching his hands, that her filing cabinet was going to have to learn a new use. He said, "Hannah May." She said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you." 2 words, the way he said everything, without ornament. She walked back up to the house beside him, with the cottonwood leaves crackling under both their boots, and they did not hold hands, and they did not touch, and they did not speak. And the not speaking was the fullest silence she had ever walked through in her life. And when they came up the porch steps, Obadiah was sitting in the rocking chair with his coffee, and he looked at them once and he said nothing, and that was how the household knew. The winter came down hard the first week of December. It came in a single night, a black wind out of the north that drove the temperature down 40 degrees between supper and dawn. And Hannah May woke in the room off the kitchen to the sound of the house complaining in every joint and the small particular hiss of fine snow being driven against the east window. She got up. She dressed by feel in the dark. She went into the kitchen and built up the stove and put on the coffee. And Silas came out a few minutes later, already dressed. And Obadiah came in from his cabin, stamping his boots in the doorway, with snow in his beard. And the 3 of them stood in the warm kitchen drinking coffee and listening to the wind. And Silas said, "We will lose stock today if we do not bring them down." Obadiah said, "The north quarter." Silas said, "The north quarter." Hannah May said, "I will saddle Pepper." They rode out in the grey light, with the snow blowing sideways across the pasture. And they worked all day, the 3 of them, gathering the cattle out of the draws where the cattle had gone for shelter, and pushing them down toward the home pasture, where the windbreak of the cottonwoods would hold the worst of it off. And by full dark they had brought down 93 head and lost only 2. An old cow who had gone down in a drift before they reached her, and a yearling who had broken a leg in a gully and had to be shot. And Silas did the shooting, because Silas was the kind of man who did the hard parts himself. And Hannah May stood at the head of the yearling and held its halter, and spoke to it in a low, even voice, while Silas put the rifle to its skull. And the yearling did not flinch, because she had asked it not to. And afterwards Silas looked at her across the body of the animal, and he said, "Hannah May," and she said, "I know." And they rode home in the dark, with the snow easing finally to a small steady fall. And Obadiah made them all eat before they took their boots off. And they ate stew at the kitchen table, with their hair wet from snowmelt, and their hands raw from the cold. And Silas said, looking at his plate, "There is no one else I would have done this day with." Hannah May said, "I know." Obadiah said, "You 2 are going to talk in whole sentences one of these days, and I am going to fall off my chair from the shock of it." They laughed. All 3 of them laughed, the laugh of people who have done a hard day and have come home from it and have all their fingers and most of their stock. And the laugh was a thing Hannah May would remember later as the moment she understood she was no longer a guest in the house. The winter went on. It went on the way winters go on, in long, quiet weeks broken by short, violent days. And they learned, the three of them, the rhythm of living together in a small house in a long cold. And the rhythm settled, and the rhythm became, by the time February came around with its blue light and its false thaws, the only rhythm any of them remembered. Silas asked her in February. He asked her on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table over coffee, without any preamble at all. The way he had decided in advance, she understood that he was going to ask her, because the way to ask Hannah May Whitlock for a thing was to ask her plain and let her answer plain. He said, "Hannah May." She said yes. He said, "Will you marry me?" She set her cup down. She said yes. He said, "In the spring, when the cottonwoods come back." She said, "In the spring." He said, "All right." She said, "All right." Obadiah, who was in the doorway with his own cup, made a small sound that might have been a hallelujah and might have been a sneeze. And he turned and walked back out into the cold without saying anything, because Obadiah Pike, after 70 years, had learned which moments were his and which were not. They were married in May, in the yard, under the cottonwoods that had come back the week before, in that particular pale green that does not last more than a few days before it deepens into summer. Asa Goodnight rode out from the county seat to stand witness, and Mrs. Pell came in the borrowed wagon with her oldest boy, and the new sheriff, Eli Booker, came in his Sunday coat with a bunch of blue stem grass tied with a piece of twine, because he had not been able to find flowers and had decided that blue stem was honest. And the preacher from the Methodist Church in Ash Hollow came in a buggy with his wife, and the wife brought a cake, and Obadiah stood beside Silas in a shirt Hannah May had washed and pressed for him 3 times to get the worst of the 70 years out of the collar. And Hannah May wore not the navy dress, but a new one, a pale grey cotton she had made herself over the winter, and her hair was pinned up with the tortoise-shell pins. And when she walked across the yard towards Silas under the cottonwoods, she walked the way she had walked down the aisle of the courtroom, without flinching, without lowering her eyes. And Silas, when she reached him, did not say anything for a moment because he could not, and that was all right, because she knew, and the preacher knew, and Obadiah knew, and the cottonwoods knew, and the saying of the words after that was only the formality the world required to write down what the yard already understood. He gave her, after the words were said, a small thing wrapped in a square of muslin. She opened it standing there in front of everyone. It was a key. It was the key to the front door of the house, polished on a leather thong, and he put the thong over her head himself and settled the key against her breastbone. And he said, quiet, only to her, "This door is yours. You open it when you want, and you close it when you want, and nobody, not me, not anybody, ever asks you again whether you have the right." She put her hand over the key. She said, "Silas." He said, "Yes." She said, "I am not going anywhere." He said, "I know." She said, "I wanted to say it out loud." He said, "I know that too." They ate the cake. They ate it on the porch, all of them, with coffee. And the afternoon went long and gold, and the cottonwoods turned silver in a small wind that came up from the south, and Mary's curtains, which were Hannah May's curtains now, lifted in the open windows behind them, and the house, which had been a quiet house for a long time, was full of voices that did not somehow disturb its quietness, but only filled it the way water fills a cup it was made for. Late, when the others had gone, Hannah May stood at the porch rail, with the key warm against her skin, and Silas beside her. And she looked out across the yard at the barn and the new shed and the south fence she had walked at sunrise on her first morning here. And she thought about the woman who had set the last staple into the cedar post in a torn navy dress with bleeding hands. And she thought about what that woman had known and what she had not known. And she thought about the tobacco tin still sitting on the windowsill in the room off the kitchen with $4.62 in it that she had never spent and never would. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she was never leaving again.